based in Toronto. He holds a PhD in English from York University, and his dissertation was about digitality and a desire for post-positionality identity. So I'd like to open our panel today by having Kate explain a little bit about the terms we'll be using and the distinctions, however nuanced they might be, between AI, big data, automation, machine learning. What do those words mean? Are there meaningful differences between them? And if so, what are they?
Well, thank you, Ayesha. I'm going to start by just saying a giant thank you for inviting us to be here, everyone from the committee, but also what a pleasure it is to be on a panel with friends and colleagues and people whose work I've known for a long time. So, hi everyone, it's great to be here. This is the what I call the shitty question, which is where we get to talk about the definitions of these terms, which become a bit of an alphabet soup when you have AI, ML, etc. And there's two ways we can talk about the way that these terms are used and operationalized. One is, I think, through looking at their histories, and the other is sort of looking at the sort of the marketing practices that subtend them. The way that I tend to think about artificial intelligence, which is the oldest of the three terms that you asked about, is that we can go back to 1956 to the Dartmouth Conference, where a group of men decided that they could solve human intelligence in a summer, and it didn't quite work out that way. But what we've seen now, effectively, is that this term, I think, operates in sort of three core ways. It's essentially referring to a subset of technical approaches. Right now, the technical approach that's in its absolute heyday is machine learning. Machine learning really came to the fore around the last 12 years, but particularly in the last 8, where we saw the emergence of convolutional neural nets and the combination of facial recognition technologies and very, very large-scale amounts of data being extracted primarily by a small handful of tech companies. So we've got these technical practices, but on top of that, these terms also refer to social practices. So ultimately, the people who are in these rooms and in these industries get to decide what artificial intelligence will be, what its problem domains will be, what sorts of issues should be addressed. And that's why also when we start to think about these questions, we have to think about who are the humans actually creating these technologies. And then finally, certainly in the case of artificial intelligence, it's also an industry. And it's an industry which has extremely concentrated power, primarily in the hands of around 7 companies worldwide, but it depends, how you count. But certainly thinking about the industrial dynamics of these tools is actually really important as well, because you have companies that have an enormous amount of power really changing the terms at will. So you see a kind of sort of cloud around, literally and figuratively, around how these terms are operationalized. And I think I've loved the way that Ingrid has talked about the way that you can really tell if something is AI.
Oh, do you want me to tell them? I just said this before because I should ask sort of like, what is the main difference between like AI or like automation or any other kind of like technical application? I was like, it's really the number of zeros you put on the contract.
Yeah. Exactly. So realistically, I think another way we could sort of think about this is almost sort of archaeologically, that sort of, big data is this term just for talking about the substrate, which is this kind of, how we recognize data and where it's extracted from. Machine learning is the next layer up in terms of how it's sort of being used, interpreted, and used to create sort of a predictive layer. And then artificial intelligence is kind of this other kind of dynamic where you could say, well, how is this being applied to particular problem domains through social spaces? So I hope that's okay for
Absolutely.
you. It's the shortest possible description I can give you. We could, of course, do a whole panel just on how those definitions are used.
No, absolutely. Thank you. I think that's very helpful. And increasingly, you mentioned these are businesses and they're concentrated largely in Silicon Valley. And John, I'd love for you to sort of explain for us the culture of Silicon Valley and the dominant ideology that's responsible for much of how this technology is conceptualized and sold and promoted.
Yeah, well, thank you. I've been thinking about this question a lot, and it's because, you know people in the Valley, or you kind of get used to the vocabularies that a lot of people use to talk about things. And for me, one of the best ways to interpret this question is sociologist Zeynep Tufekci's notion that she says Silicon Valley is the weirdest thing because it's a business about the social made by engineers. And so when you have that differentiation, you get responses to really important social and political problems, asymmetries that are just 100%, everywhere in society. You get an engineering solution, an engineering logic. And so this larger engineering logic for me is very compelling. And there's a quick example we can give. In 2009, Doug Bowman was the lead designer for Google. It's a very famous story in the worlds of I guess, artificial intelligence or just of data-centered analysis, and he's an artist. And he said, I want to have a blue for the O of Google. And the Google brass were like, actually, no. What we can do is just, because we have billions of people looking at the site every day, what you can do is you can just have A/B testing and see how many times or how many milliseconds more people are on a certain page based on that. The idea being that you remove subjectivity, you remove anything that's specific or culturally or epistemically local to the thing that's happening in order to just make a compelling insight-based argument for what should be done. And obviously you have no reason why a certain color is to just perform better based on the metrics, but part of this engineering logic or part of that ideology is that really easy ability to abstract everything in order to make it computable. And so we see this all the time. There's very famous videos that are extraordinarily prolific in showing the racism that is implicit in a lot of facial recognition algorithms, and the idea being that it's a general just sense of data that they don't necessarily think about. They think, okay, we just train it enough and it's going to come out. And so that notion that the resolution to these problems are not, let's actually reconfigure these ontological bases by which humanity is developed or by which even history is based. It's like, let's put more data, let's fine-tune the algorithms, or even let's think about, we don't need to be right all the time. We need to be right 92% of the time. That's a marketing strategy, 92% of the time is more or less good. But what's happening, the NSA has a 51% confidence measure if you're a citizen of the US or not. These ideas are, we're challenging what is epistemically true because it's no longer true or false, it's based on this percentage confidence issue that for me is very compelling to think through in terms of how knowledge works, but then it gets back to the ideology, which is that it's never you can get outside the circuit. It's constantly about the data that is, and then the algorithms and how they're programmed.
So based on what you just described, like Silicon Valley has a very unique, historically unique relationship to data and information, which were up until now used to just be words for truth, but that no longer seems to be the case. And we've often seen how the technology emerging out of Silicon Valley essentially remaps patterns of racism and sexism and reproduces those patterns because the source data contains them. Then my next question is the false neutrality of artificial intelligence a feature or a bug?
That's for me, that question. Is this on? Can people hear me? I think that the question of whether or not it's a feature or a bug depends on who you ask. Because I think that there's a sense in the Valley that it's very much a bug. I think, as John was saying, that you just need to tweak the algorithm or you just need to add in more data. And I think that it kind of stems from this weirdly almost transcendentalist ideology that exists in the Valley that is almost like this extension of the general sort of liberal humanist Enlightenment project in which the general kind of, conservative approach of we have access to objective truth. There are hierarchies of worth and of value, and it just so happens that those values happen to be, white, male, Eurocentric, et cetera, et cetera. And I think that ideology that you can somehow escape the limits of bias or subjectivity really permeates the Valley. And so I think that the idea of that we can be neutral is very much an attempt to escape subjectivity and, by extension, politics. But the weird kind of paradox of that approach is that in the very attempt to produce the neutral, you end up reproducing bias, right? That is the thing that reproduces bias. And so I think that what ends up happening is that in treating bias like a bug, you produce it as a feature.
Absolutely, and I think that desire to escape that you just mentioned, I think it is part of what inspired the name of today's panel, is God view, and this sort of desire to opt out of so much of human relationships and politics that in practice isn't possible and is creating a new politics ruled by these technocratic libertarians. And Kate, I'd love for you to get into how a lot of this emergent technology dodges accountability and either, displaces it or removes it entirely.
Yeah, I've been thinking a lot about how in the criminal justice context specifically, right, folks are probably aware that courts across the country as well as police departments are now using both predictive policing tools on the law enforcement side, and then in the courts, these what they call risk assessment instruments that determine whether or not to hold someone pre-trial in the bail context, also maybe even the length of someone's sentence, and then also what parole will be granted and what the conditions will be for parole. This is a really interesting case study, in my view, of the way in which these technologies are used as a means of avoiding systemic change and avoiding politics writ large, because there's a nationwide movement in this country to abolish cash bail. There's a traveling lawsuit going around the country finding a poor person who's been jailed because they can't afford to pay bail and filing constitutional litigation at the state level to try to say that that's unconstitutional. Such a case came to Massachusetts, and the Supreme Judicial Court in Massachusetts held that, in fact, the Massachusetts bail statute itself does not allow for the courts to jail someone because they're poor. So the legislature's response to this was not to say, maybe we ought to not incarcerate people pre-trial just as a matter of course. That should maybe be the default, which is frankly what advocates are pushing for nationwide. Advocates are saying no cash bail, presumptive release. This also has a really important impact on whether or not someone will be convicted. Folks who are allowed to go home and then show up to court for their hearing are much more likely to see those charges dismissed than people who come to court in chains from jail. So it really has a huge impact on people's freedom. Instead of adopting the more liberationist posture that would say, okay, you know, we shouldn't keep people in jail because they're poor, we ought to just move towards a presumptive release model. The Massachusetts state legislature tried to adopt a mandatory risk assessment instrument, which is sort of just a way of using technology to get around the fact that people in our country have pretty much decided it's not acceptable to jail poor people simply because they can't pay. So we were able to stop that in Massachusetts, but I think that's a really important example of a way in which these types of systems are being used in our criminal justice system, certainly in the predictive policing context. That's another example of this. You know, we don't actually look at why, you know, people are engaged in crimes. We're not really interested in pursuing a public health model with respect to drug use and addiction. We sort of continue doing the same things that we've been doing for a long time with drug policy. But now we have computers that will help police know which areas of a city to focus on, or which even individual people should be subject to heightened scrutiny by the police in places like Chicago, where there's a predictive policing program that actually targets individuals, not just geographic locations. There's another really interesting example of this, though, which is sort of the opposite. In Boston recently, some MIT researchers worked with the Boston Public Schools to try to actually create an anti-racist algorithm. There's a real problem all across the country that I didn't know about until I got involved in some of this work, which is basically about bell times in public schools and busing systems, and the decisions that are made about which public school starts at what time in the day and gets out at a different time. And these decisions actually have huge consequences for students' performance, and there are real racial equity problems, frankly, in bell times in Boston specifically. If you're a young black person in the Boston Public Schools, it is much more likely that you have to get up really early in the morning to go to school, and that you get out at like 1 p.m. And for the schools that have a higher opportunity index, AKA mostly white schools, they have later start times and get out later in the day, which correlates to better performance in a lot of ways. So these MIT researchers working with the Boston Public Schools designed an anti-racist algorithm that would actually address this problem and use machine learning techniques basically to produce a fair system that both saved the city a lot of money and tried to deal with this racial equity problem. And what happened was fascinating, because when the results of the new bell times were released, those white parents who had for so long been benefiting from this system of racial inequity were absolutely fucking livid. And those were the people who have the time and political power to crowd school committee meetings. And so it was like almost the opposite case, in which the algorithm tried to avoid politics and failed because of politics, because of the entrenched political system in Boston, in Massachusetts. So yeah, I'm just interested in the way that, algorithms are basically avoiding very difficult, political, messy human interactions.
Absolutely, and it also proves sort of the banality. Like AI and these subjects are no longer, this abstract looming specter. They're being widely adopted, and as a result, I think it's really important to grapple with what's in the public imagination already regarding these technologies and how that influences, policy. I think in the example you mentioned, one of the signs I thought was so fascinating that a white parent held up was families over algorithms, which on its surface sounds like something that we would all want to get behind, but within that very particular political context has very different implications. And I think, Ingrid, I'd love for you to tell us more about how sort of the, history really of people, like stereotypes people hold about these technologies and kind of how they're influencing how we talk about them today and what that interaction is like, whether there's any truth to it.
Yeah, I mean, first of all, algorithms over families all the way. Families is worse. But I do love, I can't get it. That's such a great... yeah, I mean, the popular cultural manifestations of artificial intelligence are not usually, maybe this is also just because, political economy doesn't really make for, a great action movie sort of scenario. But, there is a tendency, to frame kind of, a lot, I think, yeah, the common kind of, trope of, the sentient robot and it's going to do a bad thing kind of never really acknowledges, all of the human beings required to make the sentient robot and all of the human labor that kind of underpins its ability to exist. There's one scene in T3 that kind of gets at that, but we don't have time to talk about. I'm embarrassed to admit that I knew that. I shouldn't have said that on the stage. It involves a modem sound anyway. But yeah, I think there's a generally the frame, a lot of this, a lot of the stuff that is sort of generally framed as, that's far off or more this is going in and out. It's right? Thank you. Yeah, a lot of the things that are kind of maybe in a cinematic or narrative context seen as this looming threat are already around, and they're mostly made of people. That's just but I guess that's not as that's not as interesting of a villain. That kind of complicity is not really as fascinating as a robot skeleton crushing your skull.
But they're invisible. I mean, that's the thing. The people are often invisible, right?
Right.
The person who's being sentenced or told, no, you're not going to be able to go home to await trial because this risk assessment tool says that you're likely to fail to appear to court or you're dangerous. They don't know who designed that algorithm. And in fact, it's a proprietary trade secret what the algorithm actually is doing. There was a court case in Wisconsin where this guy, Eric Loomis, was arrested, was convicted of a crime, and then was sentenced in part based on one of these risk assessment tools that said, give the guy 7 years. And the judge said, okay, sure, 7 years. And he appealed that and tried to fight back and say, I want access to the code and to know about this system that, sentenced me effectively. And the Wisconsin Supreme Court said, no, you can't do that. And here's the really interesting part. The decision sort of hinged on the fact that the algorithm was not actually making the decision. It was merely informing the judge's decision. So it's this really dangerous thing where, the algorithm has a lot of power, but the power as far as the system sees it is vested solely in the hands of the judge. So nobody really is taking responsibility for that sentencing. And he appealed it to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court said no thanks. So that's the state of the law now in Wisconsin.
And what's amazing is that he actually found out. The vast majority of people have no idea that being assessed by systems, even within so-called sort of public service contexts. And this is one of the things that I find incredibly problematic, that these systems are generally being marketed and sold into a whole range of sectors: education, health, criminal justice, etc. And there's really no mechanism by which you can even be informed of the fact that these tools are now being brought to bear, either in an assistive decision context or purely actually making a decision based on whether or not your CV means you will be in the pool of potential applicants, or whether or not you're going to get a scholarship scholarship to go to university. All of these things are happening completely, as you say, sort of below the waterline. And one of the things we've been working on at AI Now is looking at this idea of like an algorithmic impact assessment. Like, how do you help public servants in these situations where they're like having huge amounts of marketing pressure to sort of buy a system and implement it? It's like, well, how do you give them tools to say, wait, all right, how do we assess how this system is going to impact not just one population, but really diverse populations? And one of the things that I think is the more radical step that can be made here, rather than just how do we assess a system to make sure it's fair, is actually how do you change the numbers of communities who get to have a say about how a system is being constituted? And I think this is the moment to really do that. And I think it's incredibly concerning to me that we're seeing the rise of this fairness discourse, which initially was a critique of these systems, that we're starting to see like lapses in fairness, now suddenly be abrogated back into engineering discourse, that we can effectively fix these problems by making systems more fair. But what you'll notice the more that you sort of spend time reading those papers and looking at the system design is that fairness is being understood as parity. And that's exactly what happened in Boston. It's like, well, as long as we make sure that everyone's getting the same bell times, then it's fair. Well, actually, no, we have to talk about justice. We have to talk about structural inequality in that city, which is extreme. And then you have to say this is a political problem first, before it's a technical problem.
That makes me think of a comment you made, which is the idea of the liberal political subject is the thing that we've used to think through in terms of what is politics for centuries, and it's still told to us. But I think what we're seeing right now is, one, we can't see these algorithms. Two, often they don't appear to us as individual discrete. Often we're put into a category or whatever. But at the end of the day, three, that these discourses are proprietary, which means that there's a multiplicity of them. And so a lot of my work, I think about how machine learning tries to figure out what gender is. But this is not a gender for politics. It's not a gender for patriarchy. It's not a gender for white supremacy. It's not a race for white supremacy or whatever. These are marketing things that are trying just to do predictive possibilities, to find out what's going to happen next. And so with this, usually we say, oh, I have politics. I'm going to go to this place. I'm going to engage with, but actually you don't go in. You don't know what it is. It's changing all the time, and there's no real teeth that any liberal political project has because of that, but also because big data requires big challenges. And it requires us to reframe, and this is something we were talking about before, what is neutral? Neutrality doesn't have to just be parity. It doesn't have to be like net neutrality is described in terms of it's politically useful, but it could be, we could think of a non-neutral network that privileges people who need bandwidth more than the rich people. And that would be a very useful political thing that goes at the level of infrastructure, but it doesn't try to say, okay, well, only if individuals got together. It has to be collective. And I think that's a really useful pivot that we can make to think about what politics is.
I was just going to say that transparency is key, and the work that you all have done at AI Now on that question is really important. I'm struggling with figuring out mechanisms by which communities can actually say no. Just straight up no, right? Like in the criminal justice system, for example. I don't know that we're actually having the really serious conversation as a society that we need to be having, which is basically an answer to this question. Do we think under any circumstances, even if the technology were to be 100% accurate, which it will never be, but say for the sake of argument that it is, do we think it's acceptable for a computer program, effectively, to decide whether or not someone is incarcerated or arrested? I mean, we're not having those conversations. We're talking about fairness and accuracy and transparency, which are important, obviously, but I think there's a threshold question that has to get asked way before we even get to those sort of characteristics of the systems, right?
I'm with you, and actually our first move is to call for a total moratorium on any system that is proprietary and cannot be investigated and audited in any public context. It is absolutely a total breach of basic due process that you cannot understand how something is working. So I think I think that this is, we're completely of one mind on this, that there are places where these systems simply should not be deployed. Another place that I think we should really do a lot more political work is around basically predictive policing. Predictive policing has not been shown to do anything other than ingrain forms of racial and essentially class bias. And there are studies by radical organizations like RAND, not exactly like people out there on the fringe, showing that these systems are not actually working. So there is this moment where I think a much higher standard of proof has to be brought to bear before any of these systems should be touching public life. And that is a space where we actually have a lot more rights than we do in, say, the straight-up corporate sector. And that's why I think it's important to focus there.
And I think that's why in talking to you all earlier before this panel, so many of my questions revolved around this constant displacement of accountability, because what that really is doing is it forecloses on the opportunity for the public to consent. And the complete absence of the, opportunity to consent or dissent from this technology, I think has pretty alarming, consequences.
One thing just that I wanted to kind of bring this up, your point about just the question of should this be here at all. I think that the weird laundering of fairness as an instrument of industry is very much relevant. So did people see earlier this week Axon, formerly Taser, announcing that they had an AI ethics board for their body camera products? Taser loves cops. They have always loved cops. They literally made a tool to help cops electrocute people. The idea that now they have an ethics board and it's going to be fine. The accountability as sought through an internal kind of in some ways I think maybe part of the challenge is not directing the call to accountability solely to companies do better, be better, because they will certainly, they're more than happy to self-regulate because that means that they continue to have the product deployments on their terms.
I was just going to say that another aspect that this affects, or another sector that this affects, and this is definitely not something that I learned watching The Good Wife, I swear, is that organ donations are also sometimes run by algorithms, and it, to me, kind of raises the question then of regulation or where legal structures come in, and I'm the only Canadian on the panel, so that's, I'm going to have a slightly more pro-statist approach, I suppose. But it is that sort of question of what kind of legal framework is possible to foreclose or preempt some of the applications of these systems, right?
Just to speak directly to that question, I always think of it this way. The only real problem that we have as a human species is climate collapse, in the sense that we can't stop it at this point. All of the stuff that we're talking about up here are things that we actually really do have control over. It's really a political question, right? Our political system is fundamentally broken in this country, at least. There are, though, I think, ways at the local and the state level to actually make some meaningful interventions. So one thing that the ACLU is doing nationwide is to try to pass local ordinances that require law enforcement to get affirmative city council approval before buying any new surveillance technology. So that would include facial recognition, predictive policing systems like that. These future-proof laws that are not about one type of technology, right, but they're about all types of these technologies that require a process. They're not prescriptive in the sense that they say yes to facial recognition and no to drones. They merely mandate that these decisions cannot be made administratively, which is what the government has been doing for, forever. And most people, frankly, don't go to city council meetings, are not, looking on the police website to try to find scraps of information about, what they've been purchasing and how long they've been using it and things. These conversations need to be surfaced, and the public, through our, local and state representatives, need to have a much more active role in making these decisions, not police chiefs who are, like you said, Kate, getting these glossy brochures from companies and receiving hundreds of millions of dollars from the federal government through to the Department of Homeland Security and the Department of Justice, and basically just wow, we can buy all these toys. That is literally how this is unfolding all across this country right now. And so there really are, to your point about law, there really are some things that we can do immediately. Certainly the larger questions about what to do about Silicon Valley and regulating things at a federal level with respect to consumer data and decision making about much more complicated things that are not so easily figure outable as things like predictive policing and facial recognition, which I think frankly we should just say no to. Those are much thornier issues.
Yeah, and let's talk about regulation for a second, because we have an extraordinary moment. You might have noticed that your inboxes right now are being stormed by Pinterest has just changed its privacy policy. Snapchat has just changed its privacy policy. Guess what? It's because of regulation. It's GDPR in Europe, which just comes into effect in, 1.5 weeks. And it's extraordinary to see that this sort of major shift towards data protection in Europe is having an enormous flow-on impact into Silicon Valley, into its own practices. And we've seen Facebook say that it's not going to afford those same protections to US citizens that it is going to give to Europeans. So we have this moment where you can see that regulation has impacts. And even if you have a sector of the world saying, okay, we're going to change practices here, that flows on into all of those Silicon Valley engineering practices. You have to shard servers differently. You have to decide who's being served what. You have to have different warnings for different people. You have to send billions of emails. These are actually signs that regulation, as much as I think in the US it's often seen as sort of a dead duck, and certainly under the current administration it definitely is at a federal level. I think it can do a lot, and certainly at the local level here we've seen the effort by de Blasio around algorithmic accountability start to get some steam. We now have a bill here in New York, which is the first in the US, and we're starting to see more movement from other countries. And again, now France is really starting to think very actively about the types of regulations that they would have purely there for French citizens. So we have an interesting moment, I think, to talk about regulation and what it could do. What concerned me, though, was, I'm sure, who here was watching the Zuckerberg moments in Congress? Did we all watch? Yeah, it was some great TV, right? Just seeing that as the US regulatory landscape was terrifying to me, because the level of debate was like, oh, well, I'm on Facebook. Yeah, great work that you built that. That's a great job you did there. I'm like, wow, this is a problem if this is how we're going to be talking about regulation.
Well, it also affirmed Silicon Valley's sort of operational sense of being exempt from politics, and the theatrics of regulation, which is what that hearing amounted to, was, I think, more so bolstering to Silicon Valley in terms of what it can get away with.
Didn't Facebook stock go up the day of those hearings? Yep. I think that kind of, because the thing that's been interesting this last month or so of people being mad again at Facebook is unlike every other time we've been mad at Facebook, they actually lost money on it. Their stock went down in a significant way, not in sort of a trivial moment. And that could be attributed to other things going on in the market, but ultimately that seemed to facilitate a lot of swift movement. And it's the second that Zuckerberg puts on a fucking tie and shows up and explains why your grandson hasn't friended you back or whatever, it's oh, all right, they're playing by the rules. We're going into they're doing the right things. And this is going back to the smooth operation before. I think one of the most frustrating things to me about the last, I'm not even going to say the name of the scandal because we all know it, and I hate their name so much, is that it sort of suggests this, if only we can go back to the good version of neoliberal surveillance, not when the bad people use it to maybe elect a fascist. There's a better way to do it when we just let the CIA elect fascists in other places or some shit.
And absolutely, and I think what's interesting, especially in America, is so much of this debate is happening on the terrain of the logic of market capitalism and neoliberalism, and a lot of it, what should be considered as issues of public policy, is being treated as consumer choices. And there's an assumption that these are, factors that people can opt in and opt out of. Even the phrase opt in and opt out is one of the rote responses of these tech platforms and companies. And I wonder how much of that is just due to a cultural difference between the way things are in America versus in Europe, which encourages more regulation, or a function of the demographics of our Congress, and I think we can all understand the urgency and necessity of change, but what would that, how do we get there? What does this moment really demand of us, since we are, as consumers, being disproportionately tasked with responding to it?
I'll respond really quickly. I'm not going to be able to say the latter part, but I was compelled to think of an example of an algorithm that came out a couple of weeks ago. It's a joint between AT&T researchers and a researcher from a university in Israel, and they found out, they're like, what if we were able to do something very banal? Like, what if we were going to be able to figure out which photos and where you are, and if you're happy in them or sad, and then when you are thinking about going on vacation, we'll have this huge cache of emotional GPS data, and then through semantic analyses as well as facial analyses, you'll be able to say, you are happiest in Rome, so you should go to Rome again. And it's weird, but it's sold, and it's very marketable, fun, profit, like, oh, that's nice. And if you're AT&T, if you own the network, as you can right now because of the regulations being reduced, you can do all this surveillance and have extraordinary data cache to then make assessments. But the interesting thing that crosses into the state is if you think of, well, okay, what if you have certain groups of people and you could figure out if they're angry? And what if those people who are angry maybe are going to get political? And what happens if you can prevent the incipient nation, civil war that might happen by saying, well, let's just completely repress this one neighborhood with police violence? And for me, that's the way that a lot of these marketing companies are able to use the same algorithms, obviously the exact same, more or less, kind of setups, to do similar things from, emotional recognition in terms of where you want to go to vacation, to eventually, large state repression. It's a really easy thing, and also there's no real regulation that can stop that short of these really important things we're talking about.
Yeah, and I think if you want to find the intermediate place between, how this is being marketed as a fun holiday tool versus to how it's being used to sort of repress political change, is you could just look at the workplace, because of course that's where we're starting to see enormous amounts of manipulation of emotional data, including a company right now that basically takes a snapshot of your face every 10 minutes to see if you're looking productive and if you're looking engaged with your work, right through to HireView, which is being used by everyone from Goldman Sachs through to Walgreens, which means that every time you do an interview, they're videoing your face and then mapping 250,000 data points to decide, are you smiling in the right places? Or are you, saying the right things in the way that our top performers do? And they match your facial movements to their top performers. So you can just imagine how that produces these unbelievably sort of rigid companies that are really just hiring people who look like everybody else. And I think at the workplace level is where you're really starting to see these be operationalized in particular ways. And certainly from a sort of a more theoretical perspective, we could have a fascinating discussion about what are the assumptions around sentiment and emotion that underlie these algorithms. Because the more I go back into the history of these systems, which I've been doing a lot of lately, it's unbelievably disturbing. It's this whole, it maps to these sort of, again, 1960s models of psychology, that there are 7 emotions and that you're having one of these at this time, which will either make you a happy and productive worker or possibly a troubled worker that we need to put through a HR process. So, I mean, again, even just starting to question these sort of fundamental assumptions around the human and affect and sentiment, I think is really important theoretical work that needs to be done.
And I wonder if that hegemonizes certain cultural tics or completely enshrines what's already, the dominant status quo. For example, I mean, in what you've just described, it's really interesting how much of what's new out of Silicon Valley is very much old in terms of how amenable it is to like regressive ideas of evolutionary psychology and cultural differences. And I can just imagine people using that technology and talking about how, well, the Chinese are very stoic and they are, inscrutable, and that's why they make this kind of worker, and really actively discriminating against those kinds of differences here. But those are technologies that are already employed by workplaces in evaluating their employees.
Yeah, I was going to say that, I mean, there's a kind of neo-colonial threat to this, because there's this weird sort of ideological tension where if you listen to the way that Google and Facebook talk about their overarching project, it's sort of weirdly like supranational in a way, or global in a way that effaces local difference. And it's a sort of really sort of dystopian vision of superseding the nation state with these Silicon Valley companies, that then not only does it push a particular kind of economic structure around the world, or an economic infrastructure around the world, it also then becomes a vector to sort of foster that neo-colonial project of spreading quote unquote Western democracy, around the world, or really free market capitalism.
So your question about change, like how do we change things? John, when you mentioned the vacation tool that AT&T is building, I saw something similar that was some company that sells photographs to people who run marathons. So they're like doing facial recognition on an entire race, a road race. And then if you sign up for this service, you give them a photograph of your face and they will pull out every time the cameras caught you while you were running, and you can pay like $1 for a photo or something like that. Facial recognition is sold to the public by the private sector as a convenience. There's another example of this. JetBlue has entered into an agreement with the US government, with the TSA, and they're in some airports, including at Logan, on certain flights, allowing you to use your face instead of a boarding pass. And I was interviewed by local media about this specific project a bunch, and reporters were telling me, like, I just went to Logan and interviewed people who were in the line to be subjected to this, and you could opt out if you wanted to, but nobody did. Everybody went through the facial recognition thing, in part, some people because they thought it was cool, right? Because there's this tendency, I think, among a lot of Americans, or maybe just human beings generally, to think that any new thing is cool. But I'm really concerned about the normalization of something like facial recognition, for example. I think that one difficulty that we are going to face in terms of addressing even something that is as, in my view, black and white as a political problem as facial recognition is this, the fact that the corporate sector, the private sector, stands to make a lot of money off of technology like this, and that people in the United States, despite the fact that I think Americans think of ourselves as people who love freedom, actually really love control and don't mind many Americans being controlled by corporations like Google and Facebook in exchange for whatever services or information or connection they provide, or by the government in exchange for the promise of security, the promise of expediency at the airport or whatever. So I actually think that a really critical political project is resistance to those systems. And that can take the form even of simply saying at the airport, absolutely fucking not. Do not take my picture. I will hand you my boarding pass. Thank you very much.
Well, it's interesting because then it'll become yet another thing that the rich are exempt from. Because if the normalization of facial recognition reaches, its ultimate saturation, then the only people that could, practically get away from it are those that can afford to alter their face. And I think those kinds of patterns are really interesting to be alerted to early because they just illuminate a lot about where things are headed. And I think it's part of what you've all just described, another ways in which American corporations are kind of operating outside of the bounds of governance, and as a result, shaping the world order around the world. And
sorry, I just have to say that I know I've been talking a lot, but a colleague of mine yesterday referenced something that somebody who works for a company that builds facial recognition tools said on a panel yesterday morning. And apparently this guy said, it's going to be great because at the airport, for example, you won't ever have to stop. You can just walk into the airport and your face will be your ticket. So nobody will ever ask you any questions. You'll be on pre-check, so your bag doesn't have to get searched. You just walk right through the airport and you get on the plane. He was selling facial recognition to elite, privileged, mostly white people on the basis that it provides them, quote, invisibility, which is fascinating because, these systems, that's part of the political problem, right? Is that, yes, Google collects all this information about us. Yes, Facebook does. Yes, they control what information we access. Yes, the police have, Palantir systems and facial recognition and all this stuff and predictive policing. The reason there isn't a, mass movement to challenge these things is that everyone is being watched and monitored and manipulated, but the impacts on individuals are so different depending on how much money you have, what color your skin is, what your education level is, where you live, right? So for powerful people, it may actually be that this guy is right, that facial recognition will be good for them. It will make rich, powerful white people's lives easier. And for political dissidents, for black folks, for immigrants, for Muslims, it is going to be literal dystopia.
I was just going to say, you said it already, but one of the most interesting things when I'm teaching at the University of Michigan, a lot of my students do the thing, well, I don't care about my privacy because I'm not doing anything. And it's the only answer to that is the people who don't care about privacy are the people who have never had a bad experience with the state in their life. Because if you have one, or if you have several, or especially if you're groups who are, family members are engaging with the state more, that privacy becomes the most survival-based, it's requisite. It's not this thing that's nice so I don't have to get ads or I'm not, persuaded in some way to vote for some party. It's like literal, being stopped by the cops, being killed, or maybe even, putting it into a system and then not being able to get out. So I just wanted to echo on that. That's right.
Absolutely. And I think at this point, we'd like to open up for the remaining few minutes we have left for any questions that people might have.
Where are the questions at? Oh, I can see one up there. I'm going to run up and come back down. Make gravity do my work for me. Here we go. Okay, here we go. Come.
First of all, thank you. That was really wonderful to all of you. So, on a very deep level, almost a sort of philosophical question, especially for Kade Crockford, I know that you wrote an article in which you talked about a data worldview, a data-based epistemology. And it seems like in order to foster the change that we would want to see in the public conversation, we would have to begin understanding what this data epistemology or data worldview really is in nature and principle. It seems like, however, that this work, which is very important, could be misconstrued to be sort of anti-science in a moment where we also need to raise awareness about how important science, whatever that word means, really is. So I guess I wonder if any of you could speak to the tension between data, critiques of data, and how important it is to do that while also affirming that we're not trying to bring back pseudoscience or mysticism per se, right?
Oh, I love this question. Thank you. I have to say I'm really worried by the fact that now people who are doing, I think, really important critical assessments of the ideologies and epistemologies of data are being called anti-science. And I'm seeing it more and more. And I'm seeing it as a particular type of critique that's coming either from the most conservative branches of computer science or from more political quadrants. And I would suggest that we have to really watch that particular threat vector, because what is most important in these critiques is not that they're anti-science, it's actually that they're saying we need more science in what's happening in these systems. And it's actually what you're certainly seeing in some forms of we could really sort of go into very sort of specific systems. It's the opposite of the scientific method. It's not that you're coming up with a hypothesis and they're sort of looking at how that's sort of playing out over a diverse set of populations. It's like, well, we've made a set of predictions and now we're just going to apply it and see what happens with a 92% confidence bound. That is not science, actually. And it's a type of exertion of power from above that I think it really needs to be critiqued a lot more. And part of this, to answer your question really, is it can be approached from many, many different angles. I think there's a really important angle for political activism here, and that's why it's a pleasure to be sharing a stage with Kade here. But it's also a really important academic project. It's also a really important artistic project. It's also a really important project for teachers, is how do you give people languages to start to question the statistical and predictive analysis of humans and their potential life paths. That's what we're talking about here. It's that profound that these systems will be used to modulate everything from your access to opportunities to your ability to get out of jail. At that point, this is a political project, and we have to query that at every level that we can. So I would say strongly resist the anti-science framing and actually get down to show me how what you're doing is actually in any way scientifically valid. Because I think if you really look into it, the more that we've been doing this right down to specific sort of algorithmic systems, I think you'll see a lot of problematic claim making that isn't necessarily based on sort of any kind of rigor whatsoever.
I would just add to that the idea that STEM is like real science and social science is fake is bullshit.
Hell yeah. All right, more questions. Good, looking around. Yeah, all right, I'm gonna grab this one. I'll make them go around.
Hi, I'm Eileen. I was very interested to hear Kate bringing up sentiment, the technique of sentiment analysis and how it's used, because my impression, I am not an expert, is that it's a bogus field if you're going to, a technique, if you're going to apply it to any kind of nuanced understanding. It's only good for just like, yeah, bad, good, sorta, kinda, right? And and also, I think you brought up, maybe other people brought up, the question of these, kind of the Silicon Valley's idea of psychology, these kind of experiments that were run, that were like these fascist fucking experiments that were run in the Bay Area with completely, now we know they were wrong, their conclusions were wrong, you know, so this is, a lot of psychology has been overturned in the last few years, and that's this kind of popular idea of how people think and how things work. So, and I'll just mention that in this kind of little field of digital humanities and literary studies, they've been doing sentimental analysis kind of experiments. And it seems to me most of them fail utterly because they're kind of doing very sophisticated stuff, or they want to find out sophisticated stuff, and it doesn't seem to work at all. Anyway, so I was just wondering if the panel thought that there was some opportunity to really kind of expose those two particular things, which I think are just so flawed and so weak, you know, to kind of bring that forth. I mean, I don't know if logic is helpful here.
I really like that, and I was really compelled by Kate's answer. Thank you. I don't need to say the beginning part. And so for me, so it's part of the neocolonialist move, is the idea that any epistemological local place can actually speak for other people. And this is, 101 humanities world, it's 101 critical theory, it's also just 101 science, like we have to do experiments at different places. All right, so because of that, I always think about, there's anthropologists who have tell us, like, there's emotions that we've never ever heard of, we don't have language for, that there's feelings that, people have 15 years after leaving the field of this one culturally specific emotional vocabulary, and they feel it. And it's the magic and kind of like the craziness of the human condition is one that can never ever be ontologically understood through a digital lens, right? And so precisely because of this, my real query is not necessarily if they're right or wrong, but how are these new epistemes, which are proprietary often or black box, how are they producing the new lived realities by which we have to engage with? Because I can smile as much as I can in front of a camera, but if that version of smiling, as Kate was saying, doesn't actually fit with that template, then I'm not smiling. And so for me, there's this really interesting arbiter. Like, that's not an arbiter necessarily of, happy or not. It's an arbiter of, like, am I the author of my subjectivity or somebody else? And for me, that's a really dismal future that explicitly is happening when these new epistemologies are being created. They're algorithmically through correlation and not at all science.
Yeah, I mean, it always feels a little bit like cheap to like look at some of these, like, not particular in sentiment analysis, but like look at, what are clearly kind of ethically dubious things and be like, also the math is bad, because it's like, well, like, yeah, but like it's also just a shitty idea. Like, it doesn't really matter if the math is bad. But there is something of kind of like, maybe rather than asking sort of like, does it work? Like, does it do it? It's kind of asking like, who does it actually work for? Like, who's served by, who benefits from, who can like kind of take advantage of the thing. Because like the math is like, I've been running into this recently, did a story about some like really problematic new predictive policing research, was showing it to like computer science people who are all like, yeah, this reads like a first year grad student wrote it. Like, they didn't really know what they were doing, but it's like, but it doesn't matter because it's still like, it's a paper and it's like written in LaTeX and it looks like important and serious. And like at the end of the day, it's whether it works or not isn't really important to the people writing it.
This is like, this is a really big one, and I'm really glad that you raised it, because I think there's 2 points to really take here. One is this question that Ingrid just raised, is like, does it really matter? Can we just say that basically any of these ideas can be circulated and deployed and redeployed in computer science as though they're useful or factual and therefore can be used to mean anything? I'd like to think it does still matter. We may not have that long for it to matter, but I think we certainly have a moment where certain types of deployments of knowledge should be seen as absolutely shameful. And I'm thinking here, for example, of the Wang and Kaczynski paper, which is sort of colloquially known as the AI gaydar paper, where they scraped an unnamed dating site assumed to be OkCupid and compared it to a bunch of Facebook data and said that they could predict with high levels of confidence whether somebody was straight or gay. And what they assumed from this was that, and they invoked actually, again, another sort of much earlier form of evolutionary biology, where they're saying that, it's all coming from basically in utero chemicals that you're being exposed to that will decide whether or not you're straight or gay. Now, this theory has been debunked itself, but it's being re-invoked in these studies as somehow a legitimate form of knowledge. And I think we actually have to push back very, very strongly, both on the kinds of operationalizations of knowledge, but also on exactly what Ingrid is saying, is like, is it even legitimate that you should be doing this? And of course that paper said, we're doing it to show how bad this is and that it can be done. I'm like, yeah, well, if you're working in epidemiology and you're like, here's a virus, we're gonna put it out there just to show you it could be done, that would not be acceptable. And I think we have a moment now to say that some of these forms of work are actually not acceptable. And sometimes it's going to be epistemological, sometimes it's going to be ethical, sometimes it's going to be legal. But frankly, I think we have to use all of the tools at our disposal because this is important. And we're starting to see these types of techniques built into the most sensitive social institutions. And once that's done, it's really hard to roll it back. So I would say yes to all of the above. We don't write out any of the things as an avenue of resistance to these types of tools and research that I think are like deeply problematic.
Thank you all very much for all of this. This was fantastic. So I wanted to kind of get back to the question of situated knowledges and epistemologies. This question of what is legitimate is a very important question. What should we not even be trying to do in the first place? And thinking about the implications of potential projects, but also the question of a positive stance on that. Like, not the positive as like a positivist, but the positive as in, something that we can actually say as a goal for ourselves. Might something like situated knowledge or intersubjectivity as a way for building something out of which we can know the world, not objectivity, because objectivity is a myth, it doesn't exist, there's no such thing. There will always be bias, it's always going to happen. But something of an intersubjective lived set of experiences that are interlocked together to get as many perspectives and as many situated knowledges as possible. Might that be beneficial to AI and machine learning going forward? Might there be some way to do that and to take those lived experiences, those situated knowledges, and put them into the systems that we're trying to build and get something better than we're doing so far?
I mean, I want to kind of repeat for you all something that Ingrid said before we got on stage, which is that there's a real asymmetry in terms of, the amount of resources, access to computing power, data that is required in order to perform these types of calculations. So companies like, the big seven, including Google, Microsoft, and Facebook, that have access to capital, huge data centers, huge amounts of computing power, and tons of information. What's the asymmetrical warfare look like? I don't know. I mean, how can we in this room do AI? Like, we can't.
Okay, so step one, we buy a submarine cable. Step two, we build some data centers. Step three, we build some wind farms for the fucking data centers so that we don't have a bad carbon footprint. Like, yeah, basically at this point, if you want to play in the space, the amount of kind of like material infrastructure you need is like pretty massive. Something, Damien, we were talking about this at lunch. I feel set up. But I think a lot about, and I don't know if I have a good, like if it is correct, but I think a lot about like then what it means to kind of have like solidarity across the supply chain in these systems, in the sense that like where do you start to think about like building like a better version? Do you start at like the layer of like mining rocks? Do you start at the layer of manufacturing? Like, and I think to be able to see those, to see that kind of like entire kind of soup to nuts, like environmental, social, political like context as like intertwined and like something where like you can't kind of like, like you have to kind of holistically look at the whole thing is like, that is kind of the situated knowledge's approach. It's the approach that says like, my fucking Amazon Echo spying on me, like, is bad, but, like, I will not feel assuaged until, like, I both feel better about this device and, like, the, worker in the Amazon fulfillment center doesn't, like, have to go to, like, one of the ambulances we have outside because it's too hot to work inside for, like, extended periods of time. Like, being able to see, like, the entirety of the system is like reading a fucking Donna Haraway essay. It's exhausting. But I wonder if...
Oh, she's better than that.
I mean...
She's fun.
I know, she's fun. I just had the experience of, like, assigning it to undergrads and, like, being like, I'm so sorry. I didn't... You're 20. You
Don't
can't.
say a word against Donna.
I mean, look, Saint Donna, blessed, praise she may be, but But the point being, like, to operate at that frequency of, like, comprehension of, like, the entire system at once, I don't know if that's a thing any one person can manage themselves, but to, like, even think about, like... To think about building something different, like, it's like one kind of has to ask, like, how far down the stack do you really want to go?
Can I say, it really worries me that when I start to hear these debates, what I hear is like, how do we build our own AI to beat the other AI? It's like, actually, maybe the political solution is not building more AI, like a staggering idea. And what is interesting is that I feel like we get trapped by exactly the same ideology in Silicon Valley, which is that the progress of technology is inevitable, and all we can do is carve out either like the open source version or a few privacy tools or maybe, data protection. And it's these tiny little buckets where we can try to say, oh, maybe here we can have some space. And it's never going to be enough. That is, you are never going to win with a strategy like that. And I think the other way you could think about this is you could completely flip that equation and say, what kind of world do you want to live in? And then how can these tools serve that vision instead of driving that vision? And this is something that, that I've been sort of writing about with Trevor Paglen, who's here in the front row, and it's something that a lot of us are thinking about, is that we're approaching this from the wrong perspective if we're immediately beginning with the technocratic question of what kind of technology is going to help us, rather than like, how do we want to live? And so I think that might be a really powerful way to start to think about that. And I think, yes, to situated knowledges, but let's put that in a bigger political program.
Yeah, I was just going to add to that I think that, I mean, see, now I feel like I'm going to get myself into trouble, but I feel like, say, for example, in the healthcare sector, I feel like there may be something useful in being able to look at, say, the health data of 10 million people, if that leads to better solutions for cancer care or medication. The obvious problem is, I think, that the ideological sort of basis driving the way that we approach that now is that it's always exposing privacy concerns, or it's about a profit motive. And so that notion of what kind of world we want to have, if we make that inversion, then, and I could be being naive here, but I would also like to think that if there are ways that you could help people using these particular technological tools, then that might become a more viable way to approach them. Like, it might be that there are still useful ways that we can use machine learning or artificial intelligence. It's just that the ideology underlying them currently tends to do the opposite of that.
All right, y'all actually just turned right into my question, so this is wonderful. In listening to this whole panel, you're dancing around like regulation and approaching how do we constrain or limit the questions. And it made me think about machine learning is at the point already where we don't actually understand what's happening. We can put a bunch of data as input, and then we get an output, and we have no idea what happened in between. And so we're trying to like now understand already the systems that we've created that we don't have language for. And this inference, like I can consent to my contacts being shared with Facebook and them understanding my social network. I can consent to Facebook knowing where I am when I open the app via location services, but I don't necessarily get to consent to them understanding all of a sudden that I'm at my therapist and I have, like other patterns on my usage allow them to infer that I have mental health problems, or there's innumerable ways that we can consent to specific data points, and we have no idea what is being inferred from them. And my question is actually something that Ingrid has written about, and this is a very leading question because it hasn't been brought up in the panel yet, and I would love for it to be discussed, of the idea of liabilities or harms. And so machine learning can infer a lot of things, and companies can treat them as neutral. They can say like, oh, well, we're just exploring what the data says. Lots of people have touched on this. But we can actually write laws that say, it doesn't matter how neutral you think it is, it's the actual real world impacts that you're held liable to. And so it doesn't matter what you're saying, we're exploring or we're just asking or we want to see where the data takes us. What you actually have to worry about is what your legal liabilities are. So if this harms people in the real world, you get to be held liable to that, and that should be the starting point. The starting point is the negative consequences, not the positive consequences, I guess. And Ingrid's written about this in regards to literal genocide, and so I'm curious if that could be explored a little bit in this panel.
They do it. Oh, cool. It's always good to know people read anything. I don't even think my mom reads my stuff, so that's nice. Okay, I'm trying to think about like how to do this without just sort of recapping something that I've already like written and said. I think I've been interested in liability as kind of a shift from accountability as like a thing to demand, partly because it seems like it has the potential, I think, to actually use something that genuinely like gets companies to like act, which is like the possibility they might lose money. I was thinking today about a thing that my friend Eleanor Saida once said to me really offhanded. She was like, corporations are like a form of artificial intelligence that we don't really like acknowledge. And so it's like sometimes it's like having to learn how to think like that machine. And it's like, okay, right now, like saying like bad press, it's like, okay, like Facebook, like they're sorry you feel that way. But like the second that they lose money, they're like, oh shit, we better do something. So like liability, if you can bring like a meaningful class action lawsuit, that could be like really interesting. The challenge is like, one, like the traditional trope of like law is slow, computers are fast, shruggy emoticon. The second maybe is that like just the amount, like law is also expensive. Like the amount of money and the amount of lawyers that Facebook can throw at a problem is like staggering. Third is also just like the best like that you can get in most instances in terms of like enforcement is kind of like drop in the bucket settlements. I think like one of the bigger class action lawsuits that Facebook had, like everyone in the class got $15. Like it's like great, cool. So I think there's a lot of possibility in like liability versus just sort of like this abstract idea of like accountable, transparent, whatever, because it actually threatens them. But I don't know. I think there's a lot of like other organizing work to be done to actually effectively weaponize the law, given how many resources are already on like the corporate side.
Yeah, to that I would just add, there's a concrete example of this. It's against the law to discriminate in housing. You can't put an ad on Craigslist that says white people only apply. That is against federal law. So Facebook got caught a number of years ago allowing people to sell ads, housing ads, only to white people. And they said, oops, sorry, when they got caught. We won't do that again. It's against federal law, my bad. And then what happened? Well, they did it again. They got caught again. So, some people I think in this community have started talking about what it would actually take for a regulatory agency to be able to truly regulate companies like Facebook and Google that, the level of complexity is so immense. These algorithms are changing constantly, right? Tons of people have their hands in them, both on the, corporate side and then the people who are actually coding them. So there really needs to be a sort of like Consumer Financial Protection Bureau type of regulatory agency at the federal level that has the power and the technical capacity to enforce even the most basic anti-discrimination law, like the federal housing law that we've had for many years. So that's just one very concrete example of how difficult it is to solve that problem.
It's almost as though you're thinking about a commission, a federal commission for like trade or something. Wild. And for what it's worth, with that particular example, the Facebook housing ads, like I think there are actually now 2 class actions against Facebook related to that story. So like, I don't know, #impact.
Right, but we can't just rely on Julia Angwin, like, to do this, right? Like, Julia Angwin is not a regulatory agency. So we should probably get a lot more Julia Angwins and pay them by the federal government and have those people enforcing the law. But nobody has said this yet, so I'm just going to say antitrust, too.
Okay, we got, I think, one more. Yeah, oh, goodness. I don't think we've had anything down here.
Hi. Someone briefly mentioned New York's algorithmic accountability bill, and I think in some ways the way it's been implemented with a lot of police unions lobbying the board that's going to be appointed kind of cuts against the idea that fairness, transparency aren't like the end goals. It's maybe some of these things shouldn't be plugged into algorithms in the first place. So I was wondering if some of y'all could talk a little bit about this bill in particular, what you think about it. Especially also like bearing in mind its origins, I think, was a city council person who was upset because they didn't know why they couldn't get more cops in their neighborhood and wanted to like be able to look into the algorithm and get more cops in their neighborhood. Thank you.
Yeah, this is a really complex situation. The first is that the board hasn't been appointed yet, so we don't know yet how that is going to look and what sorts of lobbying is going to be brought to bear on them. And certainly I think the history and the context of where this is happening, I'm going to swap out because this is the weirdo mic, is enough to give us some double mic, some real cause for concern. However, having said that, there's no such thing as perfect law. What there is a set of protocols and possibilities and languages that will emerge around how these things can be made enforceable. Now, we're not there yet, and certainly that bill is very, very open-ended. It's about creating a task force. I mean, it's so small and minor that even at this point, it doesn't even have a framework, let alone a set of people, let alone a set of enforceable mechanisms. But the fact that there is nothing of its ilk anywhere else in the entire country indicates to me that it's actually one of those moments that we should be caring a lot more about and actually watching and wanting to have a voice in and participating in it, because that's the way this stuff is going to happen. Law is an incredibly imperfect mechanism, but it is one of the mechanisms that we have. And it's interesting, I mean, I'm with Ingrid. I mean, I think we've got some really important tools that we don't use enough of. But at the same time, you're talking about a corporate sector that's really, really good at doing a type of shell game around how cases are brought against them. And you could look at exactly what happened in the sort of automobile industry in terms of liability, where you essentially play a type of regulatory arbitrage where you could be like, well, we could be sued for this much money, so we'll spend exactly this much on sort of safety precautions for this vehicle and know that a certain amount of people are going to be stuck in a burning vehicle. And that's a problem when we start to get right back down to what we were talking about earlier in terms of this idea of sort of the statistical probability that a thing will work for the majority of the people most of the time. That's a much bigger problem. So I think the fact that we're starting to see seeds of discussion, even though they're nascent, even though they're imperfect, are things that are opportunities for you to say, all right, how do we actually start to shape that better? And that's something that I think rather than just eye roll, oh my gosh, another failed bill, that we could start to say, actually, no, this is a time for a much, much more granular local political conversation.
The only thing I'd add to that is that politically, people who work in politics don't like to be the first often to do something. So there's a lot of utility just in the fact that something happened. Sure, it's not as strong as we would like it to be, but I will be able to more powerfully advocate for a stronger algorithmic transparency and justice ordinance at the Boston City Council, because you will not, don't worry, city councilors, be the first people in the country to try something like this. And that's simple but true.
So piggybacking on something that Damien asked, a lot of what you're saying about the predictive algorithms and the ability for AI to track certain biometric data sounds like scientific racism writ large via AI, which goes back to John's point about the culture of Silicon Valley trying to use engineering solutions to fix social problems. So my question is generally, how do you get out of the scientific racism and, to be clear, sexism, ableism, and all kinds of institutionalized oppressions writ large via tech if the software is actually doubling down on this? Because I can imagine a massive problem if, say, we were to run mugshots through a predictive policing algorithm to try to determine the exact biometric data for specific kinds of criminals, given the large numbers of people of color in jail.
As just a really quick response to that, that's a really good question, because for me, I'm constantly thinking about all of the engineering responses to anything. I mean, with every racist algorithm, with every sexist algorithm, there's the we'll do better, more data, whatever. Or it's the kind of sense that they blame it on the training data. There's a bunch of people like algorithms are racist, it's the data. And for me, that's like, it's obvious, right? But it gets to the larger point, which is that the training data comes from structure, and you can never, ever get perfect training data, ever. And if you've ever run a machine learning model, you realize that, you know, there's always, a lot of times machine learning is seen to be like this magical thing, like, oh, and here it arrives. No, it's, yeah, statistics, but no, it's painstaking figuring out, you know, different weights, and eventually you pop out something that might be useful. But in terms of how it reifies things, and maybe this is being a naysayer, I think with that kind of modeling, the scientific racism is 100% always going to be there if you're going to try to assess race, which goes back to Kate's point. Like, why do we need to know if somebody's gay or racialized or gendered? I mean, it's for marketing, but then it has all these other ways to get through it. But for me, the idea would be to say, what if we just said we don't want this? Or what if we would try to find ways to legislate against it? I think that the Facebook case for me is really interesting, because they actually tried to get around it by saying that you're not ethnically X, you have an ethnic affinity of X. And it's that nice semantic change that allowed them at least public, yeah. And it's like, it's so dumb. But nonetheless, it is a structural way that they avoid those questions. And I really think that the question is one of the things we should sit with, because it's not an easy solution, because it's trying to draw from a white supremacist, capitalist patriarchy world, period.
Right, and the regulatory question becomes even more complicated, because you're not allowed to do certain things on the basis of race in the United States, right? But there are proxies, so you can have an ethnic affinity. I'm not judging someone based on their race. I just see that, you know, this person really likes Kendrick Lamar and Black Panther and lives in, you know, Brownsville. Like, I didn't ask about their race at all, right? And that we're seeing that in the risk assessment instrument case, when race is not a factor, but the number of prior arrests is, right? So certainly in the United States of America, that's racialized. It makes enforcement very difficult. You know, I think that ultimately the answer is to fight back and not allow these systems to be used in the courts and in the policing context.
And I think you've touched on the thing that actually keeps me up at night, which is that we are at a historical moment where two things are happening simultaneously. One is that we're actually starting to see a rerun of the ideas of phrenology brought straight back into AI, and you've seen this since everything from the Wu and Zhang paper called Automated Criminality Inference Detection, which is like, oh, we can tell from your face if you're a criminal or not. When did that happen? Oh yes, Sir Francis Galton might have been trying that, 100 years earlier. That is happening at exactly the same time as we're starting to see the rise of race realism and this idea that, well, maybe white people just are smarter than black people. And what is even more concerning is to see the rise of those beliefs within Silicon Valley culture itself. So the call is coming from inside the house. That is the problem, that actually the people building these tools may be believing exactly these types of, I think, really terrifying sort of fundamentally racist things. So that's the situation that we have at the moment. We certainly saw this around sort of, the anti-diversity memo inside Google, which was not an aberration. There were a lot of people who really supported that memo and continue to think that, actually maybe women shouldn't really be doing computer science. Their brains are a different shape. That's kind of really, they just shouldn't. Exactly, they shouldn't be there. This is a really terrifying moment when we're starting to see the application of these tools to try and extract the truth of someone's identity from the way that they appear.
So we are completely out of time. So you want to take that energy and turn it into your TTW 19 abstract and lots of other ways to keep things together throughout the year. Did you want to have anything you wanted to say?
No, just a round of applause for our brilliant panelists. Thank you.